I'm super excited today to be speaking with one of the leading media voices, radio hosts, just all around top progressive in the national conversation, Thom Hartmann. I don't really have to introduce him because if you're listening to me, chances are you already know who Thom Hartmann is. But because I like to introduce my guests, many of you know Thom Hartmann from his show, the Thom Hartmann Program. He's been doing that for many, many years, and he's been doing the big picture since 2008. I first learned of Thom Hartmann back around 2004 when I was listening to his broadcast in South Florida. So I've been a fan for a very long time, and I'm super excited to have him on the show this morning. Thom, how are you? Thank you so much for joining me.
I'm well, and thanks for having me with you, Benjamin. It's great to be on your program this morning.
Thank you so much. It's so many places to start in a conversation with you about media, the impact of media on our political discourse, and the impact that it has, and the responsibility that we have as media voices. But allow me to start first with you being a seasoned veteran. I mean, you've been doing this for a while, and a guy like me who's brand new around the block. What are some of the biggest trends and changes that you've seen since you started with the political commentary radio broadcast to now? What are some of the biggest things that you've seen that have changed in the lay of the land?
I think probably the biggest one is that anybody can be the media. The business model is the wrong word for it, but I lack another one for example, public radio, not NPR public radio, not state-sponsored public radio, but public radio, the community radio, let's say, had historically been. This is the place where anybody in the community can come in and have a say, and so everybody had a half-hour show or an hour show or whatever they wanted, and you got in line, and and it was like the corner bar, it was where people came together. But as things like YouTube grew, people can do their show out of from anywhere. I mean, it's pretty amazing, and access it super easily. Now, what is happening is that fixed media, television and radio, increasingly are having to curate their content. They're having to look for content that's just the very best content that will draw the largest audience, because they're competing with everybody in the world now. And so, unfortunately, in community radio, a lot of the programming thinking around that, I don't think, has changed with the times, and that's creating a crisis for that industry. But beyond that, that's one of the largest changes. It used to be the weekly underground paper was where you found the news, and now hey, like an alternate or Democratic Underground or whatever, there it is.
Yeah. Some of those changes, do you think it? One of the biggest things that I've seen just over the last since 2004. Has been the decline of progressive media on platforms like talk radio, terrestrial radio, and even television. Do you think that those changes that we've seen, and I think I've heard someone call it the democratization of media, do you think that has had a major impact on progressives that hasn't been seen on conservative radio? Or what do you think is the cause and the disparity of the presence of liberal and progressive media?
Well, I think they're very different dynamics, and I'm trying to remember who wrote the piece. There was a great piece in was it on Alternet? No, I don't think so. No, it was Politico. It was Politico back about 6-8 months ago, maybe even a year ago, about how heavily subsidized conservative radio is. How conservative radio hosts are getting personal subsidies or pass-through subsidies in the form of quote advertising or speaking fees or book fees or whatever, to the tune of I think in Limbaugh's case it was $6, $7, $8 million a year. In Hannity's case it was a couple million a year. And then you go down the food chain to the people who are just on the on 100 little radio stations around the country, but they're the right-wing voices, and they're getting a $500,000, $250,000 a year in subsidies for basically pretty much anything that they do. There's a whole infrastructure to support that, of foundations, and I have a friend who's a conservative talk show host, or an acquaintance, I should say, more. But in any case, we talk fairly candidly with each other, and his thing is, if he goes out and gives a speech, if I go out and give a speech, maybe the organization will pay a speaking fee. Typically, they don't. And usually the speaking fee is like, hey, here's $1,000, or they'll let me sell some books, which I would rather have a bookstore come in and do, frankly, and that's it. If he gives a speech, even if only 5 people show up, there's a foundation that'll write him a $20,000 check for having given a speech, for spreading the message, and it's really just a form of subsidy. And there's dozens of these right-wing foundations that do this for right-wingers in the media. So much of the conservative media, at least in the radio landscape, is heavily subsidized in ways that are not all that visible. And there's no parallel to that on the left. There was for a brief period of time with Air America, but Air America was so badly run. The management of Air America was so badly run, and it was initially so badly underfunded that it never had an opportunity to succeed. I mean, keep in mind, Fox News, when Rupert Murdoch, Roger Ailes had suggested something like Fox News to Richard Nixon when he worked inside the Nixon White House.
Wow.
And tried to, I wrote a chapter about this in my book, The Crash of 2016, and for that reason, Fox has not invited me back on the network since, but which is fine. But Roger Ailes pitched this thing to Richard Nixon, calling it GOP TV. And Nixon was like, cool, see if you can raise the money. And Ailes could not raise the money for it. And back then, doing television was, more expensive than it is now. But still, he couldn't pull it off. So when he found Rupert Murdoch, a billionaire, who was willing to do this, Murdoch said, okay, whatever it takes. And they lost $100 million a year for the first 5 years. They lost almost $500 million before they made their first penny. Air America burned through $17 million in 5 years, I think, and went bankrupt. So, I mean, just compare the numbers there. If Air America had a committed billionaire behind it who was willing to lose $500 million, or there was a television, analog to that was independent and progressive, the media landscape might be very different. But, the sad reality, as is that when a conservative billionaire invests $100,000 or $1 million in conservative media or in conservative politicians, they expect to get back twice their investment in terms of lower taxes and less regulation, so that they can pour more poisons into the streams and air and things. Whereas when a liberal billionaire puts $1 million into Air America, for example, they expect to see their taxes go up. They're not. It's a completely different dynamic. It's investing in society versus investing for yourself. And one of the things that wealth does, I think, for many people, for most people, I think it has a corrosive and corrupting moral influence. Essentially, it causes people to start thinking only about themselves and their own personal world, or more and more, and being less concerned with the good of society as a whole.
That leads me to the next question, which is, because of the nature of our message as progressives, the focus on the greater society versus a message that's going to help reduce the taxes of our contributors, do you think that there's a way that we can overcome that? That's a systemic problem to our message. How do we fight back against the financial disparity, as well as the fact that our messages really are not conducive to billionaires to support what we're going to say?
Yeah. Well, that's the great challenge of our era, and it's what Bernie Sanders addressed head on by saying that he was going to run for president without money from billionaires, and without money from big corporations. And he damn near did it. And had it not been that Hillary Clinton has been such a fixture for so long and is such a part of the Democratic establishment that basically the party was ready for a coronation, and they didn't much deviate from that. I think had he been running against just another Democratic candidate. You know, this year's equivalent of John Kerry, for example.
Mm-hmm.
I think Bernie would have won the primary, and that's demonstrating the power that is out there in crowdsourcing, and that's why I think that the progressive media is showing up more and more in places like YouTube, and conservative media is basically owns the old infrastructure. You know, all there's thousands to probably close to 6,000 or 7,000 radio stations around the country that are carrying conservative shows in one form or another. Commercial stations.
Mm-hmm.
There might be 50 that are carrying, commercial stations that are carrying progressive programming, but the progressive programming is doing better than conservative programming on the internet.
Right.
And so I think it's a matter of, it's a systemic, it's a structural thing, and if we want to go after it in a big way, then we need to start basically roll back the 1996 Telecommunications Act, which allowed for the consolidation of media, put back into place the multimedia consolidation rules, so that no longer can one billionaire or one corporation own both the radio station in town, the TV station in town, and the newspaper in town, and create a universe of entrepreneurial opportunities out there for small, and localizing media businesses, frankly, relocalizing them. Now, that's a pretty big lift, given, the 20-year campaign that was very, very well funded by these big companies to create the current media infrastructure, the contemporary media monopoly, basically, what Ben Bagdikian calls it. And I think it's going to take some major changes in this country to reach that. Hopefully.
Let's actually let's shift gears. As a great segue into the primaries, the Hillary Clinton model versus the Bernie Sanders model. Well, two parts. Before we go into the actual politics of the primaries, in terms of the crowdsourcing model that Bernie Sanders had, what do you think is the potential of that? Do you think we could do it again on a national level? And do you think that can be a method of funding enough progressive voices to actually compete with conservative media?
It's a damn good question. I don't know the answer. I'm carried by Free Speech TV. They're in the middle of a fund drive right now, and the impact of, and it's not just Bernie's campaign, there's a number of progressives who are running grassroots, fund me with $25 contribution kind of campaigns. And it is making it much harder to raise appropriate levels of money for other progressive causes. And a lot of progressive groups are experiencing this, that have traditionally been supported by their membership. And in this political year, a lot of that membership has already given their money to the Bernie campaign or to the Tim Canova campaign or whatever. And, there's a relatively limited pool when you're talking about from we the people. Again, I think that this is a structural issue, and the real effort we need to make is not building. I mean, it's fine to be building a crowdfunding apparatus, and Act Blue has done a brilliant job of that. Bernie's kind of mentoring a whole new generation of politicians and activists who are doing that. But the main thing to do is the structural stuff. It's pass a constitutional amendment that reverses 100 years of Supreme Court decisions, and particularly since 76 with the Buckley versus Vallejo decision. From the George Washington administration until 1976, giving money to a politician was considered a behavior which could be regulated. In 76, the Supreme Court said, no, it's not a behavior, and therefore you can't regulate it. It is free speech, which is a protected right under the First Amendment. So it became a regulated behavior, now is a right, which is much more difficult to regulate. And then as a consequence of that, since that decision in 76, we've seen the court chop away and chop away and chop away at things that would, hold money out of politics. And this flood of billionaire cash into politics has just, it's subsumed everything. And it's really quite astonishing. So
Yeah.
that's I think where we need to be putting our efforts is to amend the Constitution,
Mm.
and and frankly, with one Supreme Court seat open right now and several others in, I'd say, virtual certainty within the next 4 years are going to become open. Um, why it's so vitally important to make sure that there's a Democrat in the White House.
Mm. So and I'm going to come back to that last part, particularly for my audience. But we can't. It's a both and, right? I'm hearing you say that we should continue to try to galvanize that crowdsourcing base, maintain it, and grow it. But we can't neglect
Sure.
fighting those structural problems that created the problem in the first place.
Right, and the billionaire forces are working really, really hard to solidify those structural things. I mean, the Pedersen Institute is now, advertising on CNN, and I mean, it's
Yeah.
just these right. I mean,
Yeah.
it's all over the place.
Yeah. And so now let's talk about the actual election. The Bernie Sanders, Hillary Clinton, the primaries are all but over, just without a concession from Bernie Sanders. And you said something that a lot of people, I'm sure in your audience as well as my audience, probably push back on, is that we need to make sure that there's a Democrat in office. What do you say to those? What do you say to those people who feel that the type of Democrat that we put in is just as problematic as a Republican that we would put in?
I would say that that's a reflection of salvationistic thinking. And I think that this is one of the major problems, both with our general culture and our political culture, and frankly with our religious cultures as well.
Mm.
And that is the idea that, it's a variation on the great man theory of history, that if only the right person comes along, that we will all be saved and everything will be wonderful. And it's BS. Right people, yes. I mean, it's a wonderful thing to have the right person, but it's not. And by the way, Bernie keeps making this point, and people keep ignoring it. And for 11 years, every Friday, he was making this point on my show. It's not the person at the top; it's the base. It's
Right.
it's the people. And so when somebody says, "Oh well, it's it's not the right kind of Democrat,"
Mhm.
well, okay, then get inside the Democratic Party, run for precinct committee chair, which you can do fairly easily in most parts of the country. The party is fairly sclerotic and aging, and they're looking for new blood. And by the way, if you Google, I think it's Concord Coalition, it's Concord something, and on YouTube, and you'll see these videos from Concord Project, I think it was called, and just put those two words and precinct committee person in, and you'll see a series of videos that were done in 2009 for the Tea Party,
Mm.
instructing local Tea Party people how to infiltrate the Republican Party, and they went all over the country. These are distributed as DVDs, and it worked. I mean,
Mm.
and basically what they point out is that the most powerful person in politics is not the president, it's not the Senate, it's not even the Supreme Court. It is the precinct committee people,
Wow.
because they get, number one, they write the platform for the party. And number two, they get to pick who the primary candidates are. So the point that was made in these videos for Tea Partiers was, if you can get 5 Tea Partiers as the 5 people, competing with each other in the Republican primary, it doesn't matter which one wins, we won. Right?
Mm.
And so similarly, if you can get, if the local precinct, if the precinct committee people, if a majority of them are progressives, and so you've got a Democratic primary where instead of an establishment Democrat and a progressive, you've got a couple of progressives going against each other, and you're going to end up with a progressive going to Congress.
Right.
And this is not rocket science, but it's also stuff that most people are really unaware of.
Hmm.
The incredible power that you can have at the local level politically. And so to just say, "Oh well, I'm sorry, she's just not good enough," or "He's not good enough," or "This person isn't perfect," is a really lazy way of or perhaps an uninformed way of not not being committed to an ongoing political process. And I'm not saying that the commitment has to be that you become a precinct committee person. It could simply be that you educate 5 friends, that you keep talking about things on Facebook, that you join, moveon.org or movetoamend.org or pdamerica.org or whatever, democracyforamerica.com. You drinking liberally, you show up every week at the bar, I mean, there's so many ways to participate, and some of which can be a lot of fun. But it's like, don't stop participating. Don't, it's, back to you.
Yeah, well, what do you think about that, though? What do you think about this idea that, I mean, clearly the style of Democrat that Hillary Clinton is entirely and wholly different than, with some similarities than Bernie Sanders, and this leadership council style Democrat that is really run the party. Would you say to someone who's walking away and saying, I'm going to vote green, for instance, would you say that what do you say about the risk of a Donald Trump versus the Hillary Clinton, when a lot of people feel that Hillary Clinton, her policies are just as repugnant as a Donald Trump would be, save the Supreme Court decisions and choices?
Well, I think you could probably come up with 20 or 30 areas where there are profound differences between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. I mean, that argument doesn't hunt. But
the sentiment is out there, though.
No, I understand, and the reason why I keep going back to the Supreme Court is that when this country was put together, I mean, there were a lot of things that the founders got wrong, and one of them that, frankly, I think that they got right and then got made wrong was having 3 branches of government that can provide some sort of balance to each other, rather than any one of those 3 branches of government being the one that basically takes over and runs everything. And the Supreme Court, and you can read this in the Federalist Papers, Federalist 77, 78, 79, as I recall, Hamilton writing about this stuff when they were selling the Constitution, and they were talking about the role of the Supreme Court. Or simply read Article 3, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution. The Supreme Court, in Article 3, Section 2, it says that the Supreme Court shall operate under regulations established by Congress. And that, it's the court of final appeal, but under regulations established by Congress. And Congress has not regulated the Supreme Court in any consequential way. And in 1803, in a case called Marbury versus Madison, for the very first time in the history of the United States, and we were a very young country at that time, it was during the Thomas Jefferson presidency, the court ruled that they could strike down a law that had been passed by Congress. Well, nowhere in the Constitution does it say that the court has that power. And Jefferson went nuts. And I've written about this in several of my books. He said, if this decision stands, then the Constitution has become a thing of wax in the hands of an unelected judiciary. And then he went on to another rant about how, judicial tyranny, accountable to nobody. And, and then he was asked by Spencer Rowan, Patrick Henry's father-in-law. He was the governor of Virginia at the time, or something. I forget his role, but anyhow, Spencer Rowan sent him his long letter saying, well, if the Supreme Court can't decide what is and isn't constitutional, who can? And Jefferson replied saying, the people themselves, which is the title, by the way, of a book by the dean of the Stanford Law School about this very issue and about how the people themselves should be the final arbiters. And Jefferson said the way that the people would exercise that is, let's say Congress passes a law that's, in the opinion of the American people, stupidly unconstitutional. It's not the role of the Supreme Court to knock down that law. It's the role of the American people to throw out those legislators and replace them with people who will undo that law. Wow. And that's the process. But in that 1803 decision produced such a huge blowback from Jefferson and pretty much everybody else. The founders were all alive then, or most of them, that the court never again, until 1856, struck down a law passed by Congress. They became what was referred to in history books as the dogs and chickens court, because America was a very agricultural country, and a very large number of the cases that got to the court and went through our court systems were fights between farmers, and very often about this guy's dog ate this guy's chicken. You know, who's responsible to pay? And the second time the Supreme Court said, we're going to strike down a law, it was in 1856, and it was in a case called Dred Scott, and, you know, which led us right into the, right into the Civil War. So, you know, there was a clear consensus prior to the 1870s, the 1880s, that the Supreme Court should not be overturning laws passed by Congress, that the Supreme Court should simply be the final court of appeals. Since basically the 1920s, the slaughterhouse cases, I'm forgetting the name of the era who the Supreme Court justice was at that time, when they knocked down the child welfare laws, they as unconstitutional, the child labor laws, and knocked down the minimum wage as unconstitutional, et cetera. And that happened, the Lochner Court, that happened from the 1920s up until roughly 1937. You know, the court started this whole, you know, we're in the Constitution business thing. And they haven't stopped. And nowadays, virtually every decision the court does is whether or not something's constitutional. This was never envisioned, or maybe envisioned by a few of the founders, but it's not, I mean, it's not what's in the Constitution. So what has happened is one branch of government has made themselves absolutely supreme over all the others. They can stop the president, they can stop Congress, they can literally invent laws. No law has ever been passed in the history of the Republic, or even proposed in any state legislature or in the federal legislature, that says that corporations should have the rights of human beings under the 14th Amendment, or that giving money to politicians is a First Amendment protected free speech right. And in fact, politicians and Congresses have written laws saying the exact opposite of both those things, thousands of times, both nationally and federally. So the Supreme Court has literally created these two laws, and you know, we're going to have to amend the Constitution to get them out. It's mind-boggling, the power that the Supreme Court in the United States has taken. Supreme Courts in other countries, other developed countries, don't have this kind of power. In Germany, for example, there is a constitutional Supreme Court. It's separate from their main Supreme Court, and it very rarely decides on anything. And it has nothing close to the power of our Supreme Court. So it's like, this is a really big deal. The president nominates people for the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court can alter, and does, the history of America with these decisions based on the Constitution, even though, in my opinion, they don't have the legal authority to do it. You know, my opinion doesn't count. They're doing it, and you know, sometimes to the good, it seems. You know, 1954 Brown v. Board, 1973 Roe v. Wade. Sometimes to the bad. You know, Citizens United, McCutcheon, things like that. So we can't ignore the Supreme Court. And anybody who says, you know, oh, well, you know, it's just going to last for another 40 years, you know, whoever gets put on the Supreme Court, it's not that big a deal. They don't understand the reality of what has happened, how America has been hijacked by 9 unelected people.
You've actually, I don't think I've ever heard that position from, I've heard that position from Mike Huckabee, right? I've never really heard that.
Oh, you'll hear it from Newt Gingrich.
Yeah. I never really hear it from progressive voices, and it's ironic. I think today is the 1-year anniversary of Obergefell versus Hodges, where, you know, we essentially made marriage equality nationwide. And so you're saying, even to the benefit or to the detriment of American society, you feel that Marbury versus Madison was just something that they gave themselves power that they should never have.
Yeah, Jefferson was right, and even in those cases, and this I've had Phyllis Schlafly on my program a number of times. She wrote a book about this called The Supremes, and by the way, a lot of progressives agree with my position. In fact, I think probably most progressives who are informed about the court. But her point was that in 1973, in the Roe v. Wade case, she was like, you can laugh all day long, Tom, thinking that this is the court doing your thing and helping your side out. And isn't that wonderful? But the reality is that because the court did that without the authorization of the people, because the people didn't do it, it built basically the anti-abortion movement. Had it been a state-by-state process that eventually led to a federal process where lawmakers who were elected by the people chose to legalize abortion nationwide, there would not have been that blowback from the anti-abortion forces, or they would have lost most of the moral authority to have that blowback. And by the way, that was coming, because in 1968 there was a I'm old enough to remember this. I was 17 years old in 1968. In 1968, there was a nationwide measles epidemic, and there was something like 30,000 deformed babies born that year as a result of that measles epidemic. They had not yet developed a vaccine for measles. And so measles exposed young women wanted to get abortions, and it was illegal in the United States. And it was a huge, I mean, this was all over the newspapers. This was being debated on television. People who weren't, who aren't as old as I am have no recollection of this. But the legalization of abortion was absolutely inevitable. Now, it might have taken an extra 10 years, and you can say, oh my God, in those 10 years, think of how many people, how many women would have died, or how, the terrible consequences, and that's true. But that said, it would have been if it took 10 more years, but it was done legislatively, it would have put the issue to rest, basically. Wow. So, and for example, we're still seeing states fighting Brown v. Board.
Yeah.
I mean, look at what's happening all across the country. They're still literally fighting Brown v. Board, which is not to say that it shouldn't have happened. I was very pleased that it happened, but even when the court does things to help us, that's not the end of it, and people just, this goes back to my argument about, the great man theory of history and, getting the perfect politician and all that sort of thing. It's like, again, the perfect Supreme Court ruling, it's salvationistic thinking. We need to take control of our own destiny. We need to be participating in the political process. Yeah. And that means inserting ourselves into the system.
Wow. So then coming full circle then, for you and I think anyone who's really thinking about this on a considering the strength of the court, the Supreme Court, really these 4 seats that are coming up eventually over the next 4 to 8 years, that's it. That's the most important thing in this election, as we continue to build on all those other policies, progressive policies we want.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right now, I mean, the Supreme Court has asserted, all kinds of insane rights or powers. The power to decide what the president can do or can't do with regard to war, what Congress can and can't do with regard to war, I mean, they're micromanaging this country at a level that, and again, I don't want to deify the founders. A lot of them were very screwed up people, but they're rolling over in their graves. I mean, and frankly, I think every democracy around the world, people who are well informed about how our Supreme Court operates relative to our country are pretty shocked by it, in other advanced democracies. And this is a topic that gets virtually no discussion because it requires a certain level of information that, we're not teaching in schools. Mm-hmm. That's why I wrote the book on equal protection, which was like, which is now actually a textbook in some colleges, about the, how the court took power. How corporations got, actually the subtitle is How Corporations Became People and What You Can Do to Fight Back. But it's basically a history of, the court and this kind of power. But the bottom line is that if in the only thing that can stand up to organize power and organize money is organize people. And we need to organize. And historically, the way that we organized was through unions. The union movement was destroyed by Ronald Reagan and benignly neglected by Democrats ever since, particularly with the DLC and all that kind of thing. And so, frankly, I think the only option we have right now is to organize politically, and that means, how do you do that? Do you try and take over the Green Party? Well, they would love that, but they're not a force in American politics. The Democratic Party is a billion-dollar machine that is wide open. BC, you couldn't do that with CNN. Hey, let's have a progressive takeover. No, it's not going to happen. But with the Democratic Party, yes, it not only could it happen, but there are a lot of people in the Democratic Party, particularly the Congressional Progressive Caucus, who would love to see it happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was talking to Bakari Sellers from North Carolina, and he was speaking to that exact thing where, this move that Bernie Sanders has made, essentially transforming his campaign into a quasi-national progressive movement to keep people galvanized and mobilized. Bakari is a Hillary Clinton supporter, and when I mentioned the strength of what Bernie Sanders' new position could bring, you know, Sellers was the first one to applaud it because he said there when he was in office, there was nothing there to help support him as a progressive. And he would love, despite his love and support for Hillary Clinton, he would absolutely love to see a progressive movement that is strong enough to actually leverage strength on a state by state and a nationwide level. And from what you're saying is that this is where we need to put our energy and our focus. And I remember the conversation we had previously about your focus on movement politics, or movements in general. What's the next play in from where Bernie Sanders is leaving us to movement politics? What do you see? What do we need to do next?
Well, Bernie's out. If I'm reading right what I'm seeing in the media, I haven't had a conversation with Bernie or his staff about this, but it looks to me like what he's doing is making a serious effort to get progressives elected around the country, and at everything from school board all the way up to U.S. Senate. And more power to him in that, and we're going to start putting as many of those progressive candidates on our programming as we can, particularly as we head into the campaign season, help them, get exposure and do fundraising and whatnot. But it can't. But the other half of Bernie's message, which people love to stand up and applaud, and give standing ovations to, but I don't know if those same people are then going to the local Democratic Party and saying, I want to become a precinct committee person. The other half of his message is, you're the revolution.
Yeah.
Right? It's not this elected guy that you're sending $25 to. He's not the revolution. And it doesn't, our Constitution doesn't have the word leader in it anywhere. It's one of the reasons that I'm frankly not all that concerned about a, quote, politician being president, as long as that politician is a Democrat. Because, the job of a politician, the principal job isn't to lead the country, it's to represent the country. It's to say, oh, the people want that. Okay, well, if that's a reasonable position and if it's consistent with my philosophical core, then I'm going to go in that direction. And so you've seen the entire Democratic Party shift on things like gay rights, for example, gay marriage, on a whole variety of issues just over the last decade. And I think this is a good thing. This is not, flip-flopping. This is evolving. This is growing, and it's always going to depend on the strength of the base. It's always going to depend on the strength of the people at the quote bottom, who really, I think, in the mind of the people who put this country together, and most progressives today, really are at the top. We should invert the pyramid, right? And have an activist movement that doesn't just vote and send in $25, but also participates in party politics or outside of party politics. If you don't like being inside a political party, be inside a movement. And there's no shortage of them. From Black Lives Matter to like I said, MoveOn.org. Get out there, get involved. But just sitting around and complaining, I'm sorry.
I wish I had my applause track this morning, because I think that's so important. I didn't bring that device in with me this morning, but that's so important. And I try to say it to my audience since day one, is that I know from personal experience inside of the Democratic Party that in some counties it's well organized and, you're going to have to wait your turn. But in most counties, it is wide open, and they're begging. They're literally asking people to please come to the meeting and help support this local chapter. And the ascend to leadership it's almost overnight in most counties that I've been through. So I'm just glad to hear you echo that sentiment, that because I personally feel the Green Party. I like the Green Party. I like what they try to do. I like their policies, but I just understand on a national level, we're up against forces that we need an equal force. And so I've been trying to not necessarily convince my audience, but expose them to the fact that that we may not get what we want this time, but we have an opportunity to change that if we get active on that local level and on the movement level. So thank you so much for echoing that sentiment above all else.
And you can be in both. I mean, it's I mean, you'd have to pick a voter registration sort of thing, but the Green Party at the local level has been doing amazing work. Not so much in the last 6 or 8 years, I don't think, but back a decade ago. I mean, they got over 300. I think it's now over 400 communities in the United States. The largest is San Francisco, to have instant runoff voting, which allows for multiple political parties to participate. That's something that we really need nationally. So, I mean, supporting Green Party efforts and in some cases supporting Green Party candidates is not an unreasonable thing to do. But right now, at the level of national and state politics, basically what we need to do, those of us who might even think of ourselves as green. I voted for Ralph Nader in 2000. I've always been a supporter of the Green Party, as well as the Democratic Party. Those of us who think of ourselves as green need to infiltrate the Democratic Party and bring these things together.
Yeah.
Or at least philosophically. I mean, the Green Party as a phenomena exists to a certain level in reaction to the corporatization of the Democratic Party. Well, let's uncorporatize it.
Right. Let's, in terms of, let me shift gears one more time, and then I'll let you get back to this beautiful Sunday morning you've got in the background. It's a beautiful scene there. In terms of the role of media, independent media, national media, all sorts of progressive media, what should we do? What's our contribution? How do we help that move? And the reason I ask that is because I got this really long letter from a follower and a supporter who essentially said that he appreciated, my voice and my opinion and my positions, but, I'm not the one out there on the ground actually mobilizing. So I shouldn't really talk as though I, pushing people to go mobilize and make them feel guilty, or not that I actually make them feel guilty, but this is what he felt. Essentially, we're preaching it, but we're not doing it. What do you feel the role is as those of us who are out here promulgating the progressive message, trying to get people mobilized in light of the fact that sometimes we're not the ones who can actually go out there and do it?
Well, like I said, there's 100 different or 1,000 different ways to be an activist. You can be an activist just by aggressively posting on your Facebook page. You can be an activist by going to drinking liberally. You can be an activist by being a talk show host. You can be an activist. You can start. In fact, there's a couple that have popped up largely as a result of the Bernie campaign. A couple of YouTube stars, who are doing activism via YouTube. Yeah. How is that any less important or consequential than going door to door and signing people up to vote? It's like, what did Jesus say? The birds have their nest in the tree. Yeah, I forget the quote, but you know what I'm talking about. We all have our roles to play.
The Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head.
Rest his head.
Yeah,
right.
Something like that. Yes.
Right. But I don't want to compare us to Jesus or anything like that. But the point is that that sounds to me like sour grapes or jealousy or something. It just doesn't sound like a rational argument to say, gee, if you're not doing the work, you shouldn't be suggesting that other people do it. What?
That's what I thought. I mean, I didn't really give any credence to what he said. I just, I kind of heard it. But then I thought about the fact that, the role that we have as media voices, it can be extremely influential. And just so, as we get ready to wrap this up, just some closing thoughts in terms of that role and what you see. What's the need? Where should we be going as progressive voices to help solve some of the problems we've talked about this morning?
I think the principal job that I see for myself, frankly, and for progressive media as a whole, is to inform, educate, activate, to give people a public square where they can hold conversation, to provoke conversation, discussion, and hopefully change. It's like, keep doing what you're doing, man. It's like, that's my message, and it's
absolutely.
And you don't have to be, you don't have to be a union member to promote unions.
Right.
I'm not black, but I support Black Lives Matter.
Right.
I'm not a woman, but I support women's rights. I mean, it's this idea of, we're waiting for the perfect So in fact, in our conversation here, we've gone from people complaining that they're waiting for the perfect politician to now people complaining that they're waiting for the perfect talk show host. It's like, get off your butt and get out there and get active.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And it's funny because actually, and I'll let you get the last word on everything today. But it's funny because I remember why I started this. I remember why I started my show because of Ferguson and the fact that I physically couldn't go there. I couldn't go there and be a part of it as much as I wanted to. And actually, this goes all the way back to 2010. I physically could not go to Occupy Wall Street because of family. And because if I left home and didn't work, I couldn't, if, my wife would leave me and I'd have nothing. And so I had a conversation with some friends. I'm like, what can we do right from where we are to affect change? Because all of us want to be there, but most of us can't be there. And from that conversation, particularly after Ferguson, came the Benjamin Dixon Show, because it became my way of contributing to this national conversation, even though I couldn't physically be in places. So I really appreciate the sentiment that you're sharing this.
Yeah, we all have our own unique skills or talents. For some people it's writing a check. For some people they have great people skills. They can or some people have great public speaking skills. They can be out there and be at the front of movements. Some people are quiet organizers. They like to do the work in the back room. God bless them. It's a kind of brain wiring that I don't have, and I'm envious of. It's like, but we all should figure out what our role is in all this, and then embrace it as aggressively and enthusiastically as we can, because these are not inconsequential times. This is an inflection moment in the history of the human race that literally could, if we handle this wrong, could lead to the demise of the human race. Yeah. And I'm speaking specifically of global warming, but you could apply that to nuclear winter probably just as easily. And these are serious times.
Thom Hartmann of the Thom Hartmann program, thank you so much for sharing some time this morning. I'll let you get back to your boat and to all the beautiful things I see in the background. I know everyone in my audience knows how to get up with you and where to find you, but it's just customary on my show. Would you please tell everyone how they can get up with you and where they can find your program?
Oh, ThomHartmann.com. However you spell it will get you there. And all the information is there. So, awesome. And thank you. Thank you, Benjamin. It's been an honor, pleasure to be with you.
My pleasure. My pleasure.